Hello, and welcome to the DT Max Productivity Features session of Synergy 2022. My name is Gerry Viteratos. I'm the head trainer here at DT Tax and Accounting. And in this presentation today, I will be showing you two productivity features that you might not be aware of that DT Max has. They're very powerful features in order to help you to produce tax returns more effectively using the program. So the two productivity features or tools in question are the DT toolkit and the DT import. In order to access these tools within DT Max, simply go to the Tools menu, choose Advanced Utilities, and then the two tools will be offered to you in the submenu here. Now, for those of you who already have a network license, you have access to these tools that I'm about to show in this video. For those who have anything less than a network license, you need to have a network license in order to use these features. Let's start with the DT toolkit. And the DT toolkit provides 4 handy and useful calculation sheets that allow you to produce certain calculations of the tax return more effectively and more quickly. The 4 calculation sheets are a capital gains transaction calculator, an adjusted cost base calculator, a disposition of notes and treasury bills calculator, and a medical reconciliation or a medical expense reconciliation. What that last one is the program essentially choosing the proper ending date for your medical expenses. Not only will you get the calculations through these sheets provided by the DT toolkit, but the results of these sheets can be imported directly into your client's data entry. DT Toolkit also includes a billable time tracker. So as you are using these calculation sheets, you can track the billable time that you've spent to perform these calculations. In order to start using DT Toolkit, you must log into the feature or the program itself. Now, in order to log in to DT Toolkit, you need to set up a security policy within your database, meaning that you need to set up a password in order to access your DT Max database. On top of it, you need to set up what's called an SDK password as well, or a System Development Kit password. In order to set both of these up, if you don't have passwords set up for your database and the SDK, simply contact our support staff, which will help you in setting it up. So let's log in and let's get started with the DT toolkit. So the way you log in is by simply clicking on the logged out button that you see here at the top right of the DT toolkit. Click on it, and now you will have the prompt to log in to the DT toolkit. So number 1, you would choose the tax year, the product, and the database language that you're using currently. You would enter your username and then enter the password that you've set up for your user ID to log in to DT Max. As I mentioned earlier, you also need to have an SDK password as well. So make sure that this SDK password is set up. If you're not sure as to how to do this, simply contact, again, our support staff. From there, you must also specify the database location for the database or client list that you are using currently. So simply click on the folder icon here for Windows Explorer and then map out the database location that you are using. Once all of this is set up in the login screen, simply click Login. And now you are connected to the DT Toolkit, and DT Toolkit in turn is connected to your DT Max client list or database. Next, you want to link DT Toolkit to the specific client that you want to import the calculation sheets that you will produce within the feature. So when you are producing these sheets, you're usually producing them for a specific client. Therefore, you want Toolkit to link up to that specific client because, as we mentioned before, DT Toolkit can export that information, and then DT Max imports the results of those calculation sheets directly into the data entry of that specific client. So in my case, I'm going to look for a specific client, which is Paul Tremblay in my database. So I do this by clicking on search, and then I can look up my client by either their SIN number, their ID number, in other words, client number assigned within the client list, or simply by their family name. So in my case, I type in the family name of Tremblay. I click find, and now DT Toolkit will go and locate every client that you have that has that family name. For my example, I want Paul Tremblay, and I will export certain calculation sheets into Paul Tremblay's file. I double click, and now the program has filled in Paul Tremblay's information. I click close. Now Toolkit is directly linked to my customer, which is Paul Tremblay. So any calculation sheet that I will produce using DT Toolkit, I can now export the results of that sheet directly into Paul Tremblay's file. Let's start with an example of stocks and mutual fund and other non-depreciable property transactions. So I click on the SMF table number here on the top, and now the program gives me the calculation sheet for any disposition of shares, mutual funds, and other shares, table number 1 in this case. So I simply start entering all the transaction information. So I'm going to start with a date, description, let's say my client sold TELUS, number of shares will say 100, proceeds of this position will say about 5,000. Again, I'm not going with actual prices here of TELUS on the market. I'm just doing this for example. You've got exchange rate that you could enter as well for this position. If it was, for example, foreign shares from a foreign exchange, you've got adjusted cost base. Let's say I paid originally, or Paul in this case paid $3,000, and I've got my gain or loss of 2,000. So I've got my first transaction that I've inputted now in table 1, or this calculation sheet for the shares, mutual funds, and other shares. So next, I can simply click on add to add a new line, or I could do control 1 in order to add a separate line in order to continue entering transactions within this sheet. So I continue on here, let's say 0707 in this case, and now I sold some BCE shares. Again, for simplicity, I'm going to put 100 shares that my client has sold. Proceeds of disposition, let's say this one was $6,000, and my adjusted cost base in this case was, let's say, 4,000. So I've got now all my transactions here. I've got the running total that the program produces as well. Okay, and all these individual transactions can be indicated within the toolkit without the need for you to input these within DT Max data entry. What toolkit will do is take the result of these transactions and export them to your client's data entry directly. Now, what's also great about this sheet is that you could save it for future reference. So for example, if your client gets audited or you need to refer back to the results of the sheet to see the details of the result of this calculation, you can simply click on the save icon right here, and you can save now this particular table or calculation sheet to your hard drive directly for future reference, and you could load it back at any time. So in my example, let's say I've done all the transactions. Usually this would be, in the double digits of transactions, but I'm just doing 2 transactions for simplicity's sake for the presentation. And now what I will do is I will prompt DT Toolkit to send this sheet or the results of this table into my client's data entry, more specifically in this case, Paul Tremblay. Now remember, you're not bound by just one table or sheet. You could produce multiple sheets and export them all one shot. So for example, I can do a disposition of share mutual funds and other shares, and I could also do a medical reconciliation at the same time for this client and export them all directly into their data entry. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to export this particular sheet directly into the file. So in order now to export it from Toolkit, from the calculation, to my client's data entry, I simply click on the export icon, which you see here looks like an arrow with a square. Click on that icon. I can save the file if I want to, as I showed before, for future reference and bring it back afterwards. In my case, I'm not going to do that. I'm simply going to export it directly into Paul Tremblay's file. So as you can see, the program gives me the option of exporting all the available tables at the same time. For now, we're just going to do that one table. So I choose table 1 in this case, which is disposition of shares. I say export, and now DT Max prompts me to tell me that the export has been successful. Click OK. I'll click close. Now I'll go into Paul Tremblay's file. And when I go into Paul Tremblay's file, I expand on capital gains. And you will notice here now, my capital gains keyword has been pre-filled with the result of table 1 or the calculation sheet for the stocks and mutual funds that DT Toolkit has produced for me. So we've just seen the first of the 4 tables that DT Toolkit calculates, and that can export the results of those tables directly into one of your client's data entries. Now let's have a look at the others that the program can do. Now let's have a look at the second table that DT Toolkit produces, or the second calculation sheet that this feature will produce, and that is the ACB calculator, or the adjusted cost base calculation. Essentially what the program does is it allows you to enter the multiple transactions for one security that the customer holds in order to arrive at the average cost base of the shares held by your customer for that security. So the way to trigger that calculation is by simply clicking on the ACB button right here. So I click on it. I'll name the share name or the security that the customer has. Let's say in this case it's BCE or Bell Canada Enterprises. Let's give it something simple so that we can remember, and let's add those shares. So now we get that table 2 of similar properties in this case. So now I can start entering, in this case, all the multitude of transactions for that same security that the customer holds in order for DT Toolkit to compute for me the average cost base of that security. But it won't just do that. It won't just give me the average cost base. If there are any sales that I've done along the way, I can also export those sales into the data entry of my client as a disposition for capital gains. And on top of it, it'll compute for me the ACB for the disposition of those shares. So let's have a look at an example. Let's take very simple numbers here so we can understand the concept. Let's say my opening balance in this case through 100 shares was $50 per share. And now I'm at $50 so far. So let's assume now for a second that 50 shares gives me enough to start dripping the dividends, let's say dripping in this case, the dividends of BC, meaning that with every dividend payment that BCE pays this customer, the customer can buy additional shares automatically. That's what the drip would be, right? So in this case, I've got 50 shares, and let's add now a transaction. Okay, so let's say now this one is the drip. Okay, and let's say within the quarter, so we start with April 1st, let's say. In this case, the customer was able to buy an additional share of BCE. Let's say BCE did pretty well. It went up to $60 a share. So they bought one share here, and it is, and it is at $60 per share. So now you see that my average cost base, I have a running total here of $50.10. So that's a running, essentially that's a running average. So let's say the customer seeing the stock's doing well, decides to buy more shares. They scrounged up a bit of money, and they'll buy an additional, let's say, 10 shares. So I'm going to add another transaction the next month. So let's go with, in this case, the month of May. The customer buys, in this case, another 10 shares, and the stock price went slightly higher, went at $62. So there's now my running total over the average cost. So far, so good. The program is keeping now this running average. And what's great about this is that I could input these, and then, as I mentioned before, I could save them afterwards and bring it back for future reference. So if, let's say my only purpose here is to just log the purchases of the shares and then come back to them later on and add the sales afterwards, I could do so as well. I can simply click on the saving icon right here and save now those transactions. So now let's say the shares have a minor pullback in this case, and the customer wants to now sell the shares. They sell, in this case, a certain number of shares. So let's add another transaction, and now I've got a sale within the next month. So let's say in the 1st of June. So on the 1st of June 2021, the customer sells shares in this case. They sell 20 shares in this case, and the proceeds of this position, we'll say in this case it was at $60 per share. So they sold about $1,200 worth in this case. And there you go. So you see that I've got my running total. So you see for my transaction now, I've got 1,023 is my ACB. And now let's assume that that's the end of the transactions that my customer has done. So now what I could do is I could say, okay, give me the closing balance here and calculate it. So there's my closing balance, and I get my average, and I continue with my average cost. Okay, so, and I have my stock transaction. So now I've got my transaction. I need to now export this transaction into my customer's data entry. So I do the same thing as I did with the first table, which was for stocks and mutual funds. I simply click on the icon Export DDT Max, which is the square with the arrow. I click on it. As I mentioned before, I can save this table for future reference and save it to my hard drive. For now, I'm not going to do it. I simply want to show the export. So I will say no. Again, the program asks me, what do I want to do? In this case, I want to export the BCE transaction. So I click on Export. It has been exported successfully. I will close this, I will shortcut this, and then when I go into Paul's file, I should have now in my capital gain section, the second, in this case, the BCE transactions, in which I was computing the average cost, but also had a disposition that I needed to declare. And you notice that I've got my proceeds here that are computed, that have been computed by me, but I've got my ACB that is computed automatically by DT Toolkit and exported into my client's data entry as the ACB of the stock transaction. So you've just seen the second table that DT Toolkit produces, or the second calculation sheet, which was in this case the ACB calculator. Now let's have a look at the third one in this case, which would be the notes and treasury bill calculator as well. Okay, so when it comes to treasury bills and notes, not only will the program calculate, in this case, the transactions done for these treasury bills or notes, In other words, the capital gains transactions, if they were sold before maturity, for example, if they will also calculate the interest that was accrued up until the point that these notes or treasury bills were sold. So let's try an example here. So let's say it is a treasury bill in this case. So I clicked here where it said a treasury bill. So the sell date, I'll put a date in this case. So as you can see, the year got completed automatically. So we'll say it is municipal. So let's enter some example amounts here. So I'll put it's about 10,000 of face value. The ACB was the same, and my proceeds disposition were higher. Let's assume right now on a theoretical basis that the value of these treasury bills was higher than what the face value was, for the simple reason that maybe the interest rates were higher for these treasury bills. So I will plug in my amount. Here we go. We'll say that my effective rate was 4%, and we'll say the number of the days that were held. In this case, around the month of I sold it in the month of May in my example. So we'll say it'll be about 120 days, let's say. So as you can see here, I've got my gain or loss that is computed automatically, and I've got my interest that was accrued up until the point of sale. So you see that both calculations are done by DT Toolkit. So I've got both of them in there. And as you could guess right now, DT Toolkit will import both of these figures directly into the data entry of my client. In this case, my example client is Paul Tremblay. Now, if I want to add another one, I could simply click on Treasury Bill here. I could click on Note, and the program will add a second transaction. But for the purposes of this example, I'm just going to focus on one. Let's now go ahead and export this calculation directly into Paul Tremblay, which is my example case here. Again, I click on Export to DT Max. Click on that. As I mentioned before, I can save the calculation that I performed within this table in DT Toolkit for future reference. I could bring it back and make further calculations or save it as a reference. So I'll say no for now. And then I will now tell the program that I want table 3 to be imported now into Paul Tremblay's file. As I mentioned before, if I produced several of the tables, we've seen 3 so far. If I produced 3 tables for Paul Tremblay within this file, I could actually tell DT Toolkit to export all 3 at the same time. I don't have to do this on a step-by-step basis as I'm doing it in this example. But again, just for the purpose of simplicity, I'm doing it step by step. So I will go and click on Export. The data has been exported. I will close. Let's shortcut here. Let's go into Paul Tremblay. So first things first, let's have a look at the capital gains. And here we are. So there's the capital gain in this case for the treasury bill in this case, which would be considered a bond in this case. And remember that I also had an interest calculation that DT Toolkit computed based on the 120 days that my customer held that treasury bill before he sold it in the market. Therefore, if I go into investments without having a T-slip, there is the interest amount that DT Toolkit computed and has exported, and now I have it imported into Paul Tremblay's file. So now let's have a look at the 4th table or calculation sheet that DT Toolkit will produce, and that is the medical reconciliation. So I'll go back to my client list, and I will go to my shortcut of DT Toolkit. Now, if you're starting from it from scratch again, remember you go to the Tools menu and you choose Advanced Utilities, and from there, so for example, Tools, Advanced Utilities, and again you go to DT Toolkit. Okay, so but remember that DT Toolkit is its own application and has a shortcut for you in your Windows taskbar, as I mentioned before. So the 4th one is the medical reconciliation, and you have access to it by simply clicking on the button that's called Medical. Okay, now with medical reconciliation, what does it do exactly? what it does is to choose for you the ending date for your medical expenses for the 12-month period that you can claim medical expenses for your clients. We know that we are allowed to claim up to 12 months of medical expenses, but this 12 months does not have to be bound within a calendar year. It can float between 2 calendar years in this case. So what would be the better option for your clients? Would it be to float the 12 months, or would it be just to claim the calendar year? This is what the medical reconciliation will do for you. You enter the receipts within those 2 calendar years, and it is DT Toolkit that will choose the ending date. And then, of course, as we saw with the other 3 tables, will export the results into your client's data entry. So we saw that we linked previously Paul Tremblay to DT Toolkit. So the reason to do this is, of course, for the export. And by doing so, the medical reconciliation also links all the family members as well. So as you can see here, you could actually list the medical expenses per family member because we've linked Toolkit to that customer's file. So Toolkit can see which customers are within that family group. Okay, which family members are within that family group. So first things first, I'm going to choose the province. So I'll say Quebec in my example. And from here, I will choose Paul. Now, I could choose any one of the family members and enter their medical expenses. I'll simply focus on Paul for my example, but just be aware that you can enter also the medical expenses of the other family members for the purposes of the reconciliation. So I'll choose Paul. Let's enter the first of these medical expenses. So let's say it was the 1st of August, 2020. In this case, remember that I'm trying to figure out whether I'm going to choose the floating year or whether I'm going to choose the calendar year, right? So I'm entering expenses that I could float into 2021. So now I could choose whether I want to export or not. Of course, I want to. I'm not going to go through all this trouble of entering these receipts one by one to not export these medical receipts into my client's file. So I'll simply plug them in. So from here, my healthcare provider, in this case, let's say it was my dentist. Description will say it is a cavity filling. And let's say the cost of that was $500. So I plug it in. I go now to the next medical receipt. Again, I choose Paul, but I could choose any family member within that family group. Now, I have medical expenses only in the next calendar year, in the calendar year that I'm in right now, which is 2021. As you notice here, the program lists it for you directly. From here now, I'll say this was done on the 2nd of February, 2021. And I'll say it's a dentist again, in this case, but I have, in this case, a cleaning. So I'll put in a cleaning and I'll put $200. Now I'll have a third receipt for Paul, again within 2021. And the third receipt for Paul will be the 1st of October, 2021. This time it was at the pharmacy, and this time it was for prescriptions. And I have about $300 worth of prescriptions. So now I've entered all my medical expenses in this case. Now I will tell the program to find the best ending date for me. And the way I do that is to get the best date. So I see the button right there to get the best date. And you'll notice, there you go. The program finds as the best date the last receipt here, which would be the 2nd of February. And you see right there, it's chosen the better period. It gives you the result of the 2. So you see that if I choose, in this case, the date of the 2nd of February, I've got $700 worth. While if I've chosen, for example, the 10th, the 1st of October, 2021, I would have only had $500 because I wouldn't have been able to include the dentist charge of $500. Now, this is more of an extreme example. Of course, you would have more expenses in between for most of the clients, but you get the point of what the program is trying to do. Okay, it's trying to get you the best date. So from there, I can now tell the program to export directly Okay, and I can even say to recalculate with the selected date. So notice that the date has been chosen by the program. There's a suggested amount, and then tells you what carry forward amount I would have for the following year in the summary area below. So I will say recalculate with the best one. Here you go. Okay, so the program has recalculated in this case. And now what I'll tell it is to export it directly into my client's data entry. Again, the same button as we saw before, export to DT Max. Now, in this case, saving would be a really wise idea in order for you to have the carry forward, of the result, especially the carry forward amount in this case. And I would say yes, and save it, for example. Okay, so I'm not going to go through it right now, but just you get the gist of it. And then from there, let's just do it again. And I will say table for medical reconciliation, export. The data has been exported successfully. I will close. I will shortcut over here. And now when I go to Paul Tremblay and I go into the medical expenses section, you will notice now that my medical receipts have been imported directly with the dates and with a proper medical last date as well. Okay, and now that's the fourth table that the program offers. So we've just seen the four tables or calculation sheets that DT Toolkit produces. And you can see really the handiness of something like a DT Toolkit because these are entries that are very time consuming for you to do directly within the client's data entry. And therefore, these tables offer you a really nice, productivity shortcut, I guess you could say, in order to produce these calculations and to export the results of these calculations directly into your customer's data entry. Now let's have a look at the second productivity tool that is offered by DT Max within the tools menu, and that is the DT import feature. So again, I go to the tools menu, I choose advanced utilities, and now I choose DT import. So what is DT import? DT import, very simply put, is a direct link between two of Thomson Reuters DT Tax and Accounting applications. And that would be DT Max and DT Formax. So very simply put, what DT import will do is allow you to import the slips that you produce for your customers within DT Formax to import them directly into DT Max. So from Formax, you are exporting and you are importing directly into DT Max. And of course, through this export and import feature, your slips will be auto-completed by this tool called DT import. So let's start the process. Let's go ahead and first thing we have to do is log in to DT import. Just like we did with the DT Toolkit, we need to log into the database directly from DT import. So I will choose here 2021 is my tax year. My product is T1. My language will be English. User ID was the same one that I used before. Passcode is the one that I used to go into DT Max. I put in my SDK password. Remember what I mentioned before. You need not only to have a password policy to log into DT Max, but also an SDK password as well. This, our support staff can show you how to set these two up. And now we'll choose a database location as well. This is very simply put where your database is located for DT Max, where all your client files are located. If you're not sure as to where to go, simply look at the top of the screen of DT Max and you'll notice the path directly indicated to you just after the version number. So here in my case, it's C DT Max. So I will click on Browse. I will go to my C drive here and I will choose DT Max. So I've entered all the information in order for DT import to be logged in. So I will log in. Here we go. I'm connected now. Now, some of you might not be aware of our DT Formax, which is our forms-based package. So it is our application that we sell to preparers like you in order to produce slips that are required for your clients, be it T4 slips, T5 slips, and so on. Okay, so this is what this application is about. So once you have produced the slips for your clients, then you can electronically transmit these slips directly to the CRA and, if applicable, to Revenue Quebec. So in my case, I've produced the slip for Paul Tremblay, which is my dummy client that I keep using for the presentation. So I've got his slip right here. I'm ready now to transmit. I have no diagnostics telling me that I cannot transmit. So I click on the electronic transmission button right here, which is the E. And then from there, I tell the program to generate what's called the XML file. And the XML file is simply the format of the file that the CRA and Revenue Quebec accept when it comes to the transmission of tax slips to them. Okay, so what you would do is you would choose the slips that were there. Now, in my case, I've got a very simple example of only a T4 and a Releve 1 for my client. From there, I simply choose that slip and I tell the program to generate the XML file. And this will be the file that I will use to transmit to Revenue Canada and to Revenue Quebec, in my example, the slips that I need to transmit to both governments on behalf of my client. Okay, so I simply click on Generate. In the setup of Formax, you have a standard folder where all of these XML files will reside, because when you're going to log into the CRA site and to the Revenue Quebec site, they're going to ask you to attach those files directly to the site, and you will attach them using the folders that you've assigned in your setup within DT Formax. So once that is done, you click on Generate. I've already done it ahead of time, but just this, once you click on Generate, the program will simply generate those files. Once those files have been generated, from there you simply return to the DT import application here, and you simply click on Browse for the DT Formax side. Now notice you've got several types of slips that you can import, be it T3, T4s, or T5s. Okay, so in my example, I'm going to have the T4, in this case, that I want to import directly. So again, there's the XML file that Formax has already created for me because I needed those files to transmit electronically. So I will click on Browse. And from here, I will go directly into my specified folder. Federal, there's my employer over here. And I've got my XML file linked now on the federal side. Since my client is also in Quebec, I'll do the same thing for the Releve 1. So again, I would go to the e-file folder. I go to Quebec, and these are folders that you preset in Formax. So these are where all your XML files will reside. So I will go into Employer Inc. I've got my Releve 1 in this case. There's the XML file. It's already set up. So now I've logged in. So DT import is logged into my database. I've got the relevant files that I need in order to import the slips from DT Formax. Now I need to link it to a client. Okay, and now you don't actually have to search for the client. Once you've linked up those files here, you can simply tell the program to get the list. And when it gets the list, notice that it sees that you have matching identification information between DT Formax and DT Max. So you've got a client that's Paul Tremblay with the same SIN number between DT Formax and DT Max. So once it gets that client list here, double click and everything will be pre-filled right there. And then once that is done, I simply click on Export. So I click on the Export button right here. And once I click on Export, the data has been exported successfully. That's perfect. I'll shortcut this, go to Paul Tremblay, and if I go to the T4 area, I've already got a T4 slip here, but there is my second T4 slip that I have produced now directly, in this case, directly imported from Formax into DT Max using, in this case, the DT import feature within DT Max. So you could obviously see here, how handy a DT import program can be in this case of the entries. Now you might ask yourselves, yeah, but I've also got AutoFile My Return, which is true. You could use AutoFile My Return, which is within DT Max, to import that same slip as well. However, you have to wait until the CRA has acknowledged the slips that you have transmitted to them and has put them in the database of AFR before you can actually import that data entry. Meantime, by using the DT import feature, using this tool directly, you don't have to wait for the CRA to have that slip directly in their data bank. You've already produced the slip using DT4max. You have access to that import now immediately from the moment that you've completed DT4max. So you don't have to waste that time in between when you've transmitted the slip and when the CRA actually acknowledges and puts the slip in the database and wait for AFR. You could import now those slips directly since you are the one that is producing those slips. So we hope you enjoyed this demonstration of these two features or tools that are offered within DTMax. Again, to gain access to them, you simply go to the Tools menu, you choose Advanced Utilities, and you've got your DT import and your DT toolkit. Now, also remember that these are included with a network license, meaning if you already got a network license with DTMax, there's no extra charges for these two tools. They're included with DTMax. And I think we made the point in this presentation as far as how handy these features can be and these tools can be with the production of your tax return. Now remember as well that you need to set up a password policy for your database and also set up an SDK password, which you can do if you're not that well versed or you're not comfortable doing it on your own. You simply call our support staff who will do it for you. Thank you for watching.